The world is quick to hide the children it does not understand, but destiny has never asked for the world's permission. Before the first rays of dawn reached the snow-covered pines of Frost Hollow Pack, a single lantern glowed inside the Harper family's weathered farmhouse. Its warm light should have promised comfort, yet 19-year-old Evelyn Harper stood silently beside the kitchen window, her pale fingers resting against the cold glass as she watched fresh snow settle across the yard. Every winter morning looked the same, but today carried a strange heaviness that made even the quiet forest seem unwilling to breathe. Evelyn had always looked different from everyone around her. Her hair was as white as newly fallen snow, her eyelashes nearly invisible against porcelain skin, and her crystal blue eyes reflected the moonlight long after sunrise. Children had once whispered that she had been born from winter itself. Adults chose crueler words, calling her a curse, an omen, a mistake the moon goddess had forgotten to finish. She had learned years ago that silence hurt less than defending herself. While other daughters braided flowers into their hair during spring festivals, Evelyn spent her days washing clothes, gathering firewood, baking bread, and tending the small vegetable garden that barely survived each season. She never complained. Kindness had become her quiet rebellion in a world that rarely returned it. Even after every insult, she still left extra bread outside for hungry travelers. Even after every whispered judgment, she still smiled gently at frightened children who hid behind their parents whenever they saw her unusual appearance. Deep inside, she believed goodness mattered even when nobody noticed. The old grandfather clock struck 5 soft chimes. From the next room came hushed voices. Her father, Thomas Harper, rarely spoke so early unless something serious weighed on his mind. Evelyn lowered her eyes, intending to step away, but one sentence froze her where she stood. "They'll be here before sunrise." Her mother's trembling reply barely rose above a whisper. "Do we truly have another choice?" Thomas answered with a long silence before exhaling heavily. "People will never accept her. They never have. This is the only way the family survives." Evelyn felt her heartbeat slow instead of race. She had spent 19 years hoping that one day her parents would look at her with pride instead of shame. Somewhere along the years, hope had quietly become expectation, and expectation had slowly turned into resignation. She closed her eyes, forcing herself not to imagine what those words truly meant. Outside, the wind carried the distant creak of wagon wheels climbing the frozen road toward the farmhouse. She recognized neither the sound nor the visitors, yet something deep inside her chest whispered that nothing would ever be the same again. She quietly wrapped a faded gray cloak around her shoulders and stepped outside before anyone called her name. The icy air bit gently against her skin, but she welcomed it. Winter had always been kinder than people. As she crossed the small yard, she noticed a tiny white songbird struggling beneath a broken branch weighed down by fresh snow. Without hesitation, Evelyn knelt in the freezing powder, carefully lifting the branch with both hands until the frightened bird fluttered free. It perched on her wrist for only a heartbeat before soaring into the brightening sky. She smiled softly as it disappeared beyond the towering pines. "Fly somewhere they don't fear you," she whispered. Behind her, wagon wheels rolled to a stop. 3 strangers stepped down, dressed in dark traveling cloaks embroidered with silver wolves. They exchanged quiet words with Thomas before placing a heavy leather pouch into his waiting hands. The unmistakable clink of silver coins echoed across the silent yard. Evelyn looked from the pouch to her father's lowered eyes. For the first time in 19 years, he could not meet her gaze. The realization settled over her with heartbreaking calm. She had not been invited to begin a new life. She had been exchanged for one. The silver coins disappeared into Thomas Harper's trembling hands without another word. None of the strangers smiled. None of them looked pleased by the bargain they had just completed. Their expressions carried the weary emptiness of people who had witnessed too many families trading away things they could no longer bear to keep. Evelyn stood quietly in the snow, her pale blue eyes resting on her father's face one final time. She searched for anger, regret, even shame, but found only exhaustion. It hurt more than hatred ever could. Her mother remained frozen beside the farmhouse door, clutching her wool shawl so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Tears shimmered in her eyes, yet she never stepped forward. She never whispered goodbye. She simply watched as though her daughter had already become someone else's memory. One of the travelers approached Evelyn with careful, measured steps. He appeared to be in his early 50s, his brown beard touched with gray and his weathered face softened by kind eyes that did not carry the suspicion she had grown accustomed to seeing. "My name is Gideon," he said gently. "We have a long journey ahead of us." Evelyn nodded once. "May I gather my things?" Gideon glanced toward Thomas before answering. "Of course." She returned inside the farmhouse without rushing. There was very little to collect. A neatly folded gray dress, a worn wool blanket stitched by her grandmother years before she passed away, a small wooden comb with several missing teeth, and the weather journal where she quietly recorded every flower she had ever discovered in the surrounding forest. She paused beside the tiny shelf near her bed where a smooth white feather rested. It had belonged to the little songbird she had once rescued during another harsh winter. She slipped it carefully between the pages of her journal before closing it. Nothing else in the room truly belonged to her. When she stepped outside again, the wagon waited beneath the pale morning sky. Thomas finally looked toward her, opening his mouth as if searching for words that had arrived 19 years too late. None came. Evelyn offered him a small, peaceful smile instead. "I hope the farm survives the winter," she said softly. Those simple words seemed to break something inside him, but before he could answer, Gideon helped her climb into the wagon. The horses began moving north along the frozen road. Frost Hollow Pack slowly disappeared behind rolling hills blanketed in white. Evelyn never looked back. The journey stretched across endless forests where towering pines stood like silent guardians beneath a pale blue sky. Hours passed with little conversation. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of horses' hooves, wooden wheels rolling across packed snow, and the occasional cry of distant hawks circling overhead. At midday, the travelers stopped beside a narrow creek that had not yet frozen completely. While the others prepared a modest meal of bread and dried venison, Evelyn wandered only a few yards away, drawn by a faint rustling beneath a fallen cedar branch. Hidden among the snow was a tiny white wolf pup no larger than a house cat. One of its front paws had become tangled beneath broken branches after last night's storm. The frightened little creature whimpered softly but never growled. Its bright silver eyes watched Evelyn with cautious curiosity instead of fear. Without hesitation, she knelt in the snow, carefully lifting the heavy branch with both hands before gently freeing the pup. "There you are," she whispered. "You are safe now." The little wolf did not run. Instead, it leaned against her leg, shivering from the cold. Evelyn wrapped it inside the edge of her gray cloak and softly stroked its snowy fur until its trembling slowed. Gideon noticed the scene from across the clearing. "You should be careful," another traveler warned. "Wild wolves belong to no one." Gideon quietly shook his head. "Not every frightened creature intends to harm you." Evelyn smiled faintly without looking up. Sometimes they only need someone who is willing to stop walking long enough to notice them. After several minutes, the tiny wolf pup gently climbed from her lap. It looked toward the northern forest, then back at Evelyn, as if memorizing her face before disappearing silently between the snow-covered trees. None of them realized a pair of distant silver eyes had been watching from the shadows beyond the pines the entire time. High upon a rocky ridge overlooking the clearing stood an enormous white wolf unlike anything any of the travelers had ever imagined. His thick fur shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight like fresh mountain snow, and his calm silver eyes remained fixed on the young woman below. He watched her until the wagon disappeared once more beneath the endless canopy of winter branches. Only then did the great wolf lift his head toward the quiet sky, releasing a single low howl that echoed across the frozen valley before vanishing into the northern wilderness. By the third morning, the forest slowly gave way to open valleys where countless banners fluttered above the largest gathering Evelyn had ever seen. Dozens of towering pavilions stretched across the snowy plain, each carrying the crest of a different wolf pack. Noble families arrived in polished carriages trimmed with silver, while powerful alphas rode magnificent horses through wide stone gates decorated with evergreen branches and white roses. Music drifted through the crisp winter air, mingling with cheerful conversations and the scent of fresh bread, roasted apples, and pine. It looked less like a ceremony and more like an entire kingdom preparing to witness history. Evelyn remained seated quietly inside Gideon's wagon until he stopped beside a smaller row of supply tents near the edge of the festival grounds. "We have arrived," he said gently. "This is the moon-choosing festival." Evelyn looked around with quiet curiosity. "Why have you brought me here?" Gideon hesitated before answering. "Every unmated Omega within the Northern Territories has been summoned. The White Alpha King will attend this year's gathering." Evelyn lowered her eyes. She had heard stories about him since childhood. Some called him the strongest alpha in generations. Others claimed that wolves stopped fighting the moment he entered a room. Many believed the moon goddess herself had blessed his bloodline. Yet none of those stories had ever mattered to a girl who spent her life hidden behind farmhouse walls. She stepped down from the wagon, carefully brushing snow from her worn gray cloak. Compared to the elegant gowns surrounding her, she looked almost invisible. Young women wearing velvet dresses embroidered with silver thread walked confidently toward the central pavilion, their families proudly introducing them to neighboring packs. Mothers adjusted jeweled necklaces while fathers smiled with hopeful ambition. Evelyn simply carried her folded blanket and weathered journal beneath one arm. Nobody introduced her. Nobody even asked her name. As she followed Gideon through the bustling pathways, conversations gradually softened whenever strangers noticed her unusual appearance. Curious eyes lingered on her snow-white hair before quickly turning away. Some whispered behind gloved hands. Others stared openly for only a second before pretending they had seen nothing at all. Evelyn had lived with those glances for 19 years. They no longer surprised her, although they still settled quietly against her heart. Gideon stopped beside a modest canvas tent reserved for attendants and traveling workers rather than honored guests. "You may rest here until sunset," he explained. "Food will be delivered shortly." Evelyn smiled gratefully. "Thank you for showing me kindness." Gideon looked almost embarrassed. Kindness should never be remarkable. After he walked away, Evelyn stepped outside again, unable to ignore the beauty surrounding her. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the afternoon sunlight as children laughed between rows of decorated pine trees. Musicians tuned violins near a stone fountain while craftsmen displayed carved wooden wolves, woven blankets, and delicate silver jewelry inspired by ancient moon symbols. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to simply enjoy watching people celebrate together. Near the fountain, a little girl suddenly burst into tears after dropping a tiny cloth wolf into the icy water. Several adults hurried past without noticing. Evelyn quietly walked over, knelt beside the frozen edge, and carefully reached far enough to retrieve the soaked toy before the current carried it away. The little girl looked up with wide brown eyes. "You got him back," she whispered. Evelyn gently squeezed the water from the toy before handing it back with a warm smile. "He was waiting for you." The child hugged the cloth wolf tightly and smiled brighter than the winter sun. Her mother hurried over moments later, thanking Evelyn sincerely before leading her daughter away. It was a small moment, almost invisible among thousands of visitors, yet someone noticed. High above the festival grounds, inside the royal observation balcony overlooking the valley, a tall man dressed in an elegant white cloak stood silently beside an open window. His silver eyes followed the pale young woman below as she walked away without expecting gratitude or recognition. Beside him stood an elderly advisor who quietly unfolded a list of distinguished Omega families scheduled to attend the evening ceremony. "Your Majesty," the advisor said respectfully, "the daughters of every noble house have arrived. Shall I begin the introductions before sunset?" The White Alpha King did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the distant figure disappearing into the crowd below. At last he spoke in a calm voice that carried quiet certainty. "There is one guest whose name is not written on your list." The advisor frowned in confusion. "Who would that be, Your Majesty?" The king watched the gray cloak vanish beyond the market tents before replying. "The one who does not yet realize the moon has already begun leading her here." As the winter sun slipped lower behind the distant mountains, bronze bells echoed across the festival grounds, calling every guest toward the grand moon pavilion. Hundreds of lanterns flickered to life one after another, transforming the snowy valley into a sea of golden light that shimmered beneath the coming twilight. Evelyn followed the growing crowd at a respectful distance, careful never to stand in anyone's way. Noble families gathered proudly beneath embroidered banners while servants hurried between rows of carved wooden benches carrying warm drinks and thick wool blankets for honored guests. At the center of the enormous pavilion stood a polished stone platform surrounded by silver columns carved with wolves gazing toward the moon. Tonight, every eye would eventually turn toward that stage. Evelyn quietly found an empty place near the back where the shadows reached almost to the edge of the forest. She had no expectation of being noticed. Remaining unseen had become as natural as breathing. Around her, conversations flowed with excitement as families speculated about which distinguished Omega might become the future Luna. Elegant young women stood together in dazzling gowns of sapphire, emerald, ivory, and silver, their jewelry sparkling beneath the lantern light. Every smile carried confidence. Every introduction sounded rehearsed. Evelyn looked down at the sleeves of her simple gray dress and gently brushed away a few snowflakes that had melted into the fabric. She reminded herself that she was only passing through someone else's celebration. A sudden voice interrupted her thoughts. I knew I recognized that hair. Evelyn slowly turned. A middle-aged merchant wearing an expensive fur-lined coat stared at her with open disbelief before his expression shifted into amused recognition. You are the Harper girl from Frost Hollow. Several nearby guests glanced toward them with curiosity. Another merchant stepped closer. The albino daughter? The first man laughed softly enough to attract even more attention. The very one. I remember hearing that her own family finally gave her away. The whispers spread with astonishing speed. Names were rarely remembered at gatherings like this, but unusual stories traveled effortlessly. Evelyn lowered her eyes, hoping the conversation would fade if she remained silent. Instead, more strangers drifted closer, drawn by curiosity rather than cruelty. Yet their fascination carried its own quiet weight. Is it true? Someone asked. Did they really exchange her for silver? I heard no pack wanted her. Poor thing. No, unfortunate family. The words floated through the cold evening air like snowflakes, light enough to seem harmless, yet impossible to ignore. Evelyn clasped her journal against her chest, reminding herself to breathe slowly. She had survived far worse than whispers. Across the pavilion, several elegantly dressed young Omegas noticed the growing crowd. One of them, a confident blonde named Vanessa Sinclair, gracefully approached with two companions at her side. Her smile was perfectly polite, but her curious eyes lingered on Evelyn's pale features. You must be the young woman everyone is discussing, Vanessa said pleasantly. I suppose every festival has at least one unforgettable guest. Her companions exchanged restrained smiles. Evelyn answered with quiet courtesy. I did not come here to become anyone's conversation. Vanessa tilted her head thoughtfully. Then perhaps tonight will be easier if you remain where fewer people can see you. Some appearances invite unnecessary attention. The words were delivered gently enough to sound like advice, yet they settled over the surrounding silence with unmistakable meaning. A few nearby guests looked away, uncomfortable. Others pretended not to hear. Evelyn simply nodded once. Thank you for your concern. She stepped aside, refusing to answer pride with pride. That simple grace somehow made the moment even quieter. Before anyone could speak again, a small commotion rose near the entrance. An elderly woman had stumbled while carrying a basket filled with ceremonial white roses prepared for the evening procession. Delicate flowers scattered across the stone walkway as people instinctively stepped around them, unwilling to wrinkle expensive clothing or delay their arrival. Without hesitation, Evelyn crossed the open space and knelt beside the woman. She carefully gathered each rose, brushing away loose snow before returning them to the basket one by one. Take your time, she said warmly. There is no rush. The elderly woman smiled with grateful eyes. Thank you, child. As Evelyn helped her to her feet, neither of them noticed the royal balcony overlooking the pavilion. Standing behind carved white stone, the White Alpha King watched every quiet movement below. He had witnessed the whispers. He had seen the curious stares. But what held his attention was not the judgment of the crowd. It was the young woman who answered humiliation with dignity and chose compassion even when no one offered it to her. His silver eyes never left Evelyn as the first royal trumpet sounded across the valley, announcing that the ceremony was finally about to begin. The sound of the royal trumpets rolled across the valley like distant thunder, and every conversation dissolved into complete silence. Hundreds of guests rose to their feet at once as the enormous silver doors at the front of the Grand Moon Pavilion slowly opened. A cold winter breeze swept through the hall, carrying the scent of pine, snow, and something older, something powerful enough to make every wolf instinctively lower their eyes. The royal guard entered first, their polished white armor reflecting the lantern light with every measured step. Behind them walked elders, advisors, and the high priest of the moon temple dressed in flowing ivory robes embroidered with ancient silver runes. Then, without announcement, he appeared. The white Alpha King walked with calm, unhurried confidence that required no display of force. He was taller than every guard surrounding him, his white ceremonial cloak falling almost to the polished stone beneath his boots. His silver hair rested neatly against the collar of his cloak, and his clear gray eyes reflected the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed to prove his strength. Every noble family bowed immediately. Every Alpha lowered his head in respect. Every Omega stood perfectly still. Even the restless children became silent as he passed. Evelyn remained near the back beside the carved wooden pillar, respectfully lowering her eyes with everyone else. She had imagined many versions of the white Alpha King throughout her childhood, shaped by stories whispered beside fireplaces during long winters. None of those stories had prepared her for the quiet dignity that surrounded him. He did not appear cold or proud. Instead, he carried the peaceful confidence of someone completely at ease with the weight of responsibility resting upon his shoulders. The high priest raised his hands toward the moon beginning to rise beyond the open roof of the pavilion. His voice echoed across the gathering. May the moon goddess guide every heart with wisdom. May truth stand above beauty, and may character shine brighter than appearance. The words lingered in the crisp evening air. The king listened without speaking. His gaze slowly moved across the assembled guests as introductions began. One by one, respected families presented their daughters with graceful rehearsed bows. Each young woman offered polite greetings while their parents proudly described their accomplishments, lineage, and noble traditions. Advisors quietly recorded every introduction upon long parchment scrolls. The ceremony unfolded exactly as generations had expected. Yet something unusual soon became clear. Although the king listened courteously to every presentation, his eyes never rested upon any candidate for more than a few respectful moments before continuing onward. Murmurs quietly spread through the audience. Some wondered whether no one had met his expectations. Others believed he simply wished to honor every family equally before making a decision. From the back of the pavilion, Evelyn watched in peaceful silence. She felt strangely detached from the anticipation surrounding everyone else. This world belonged to people whose names carried influence and whose futures had always been carefully planned. Hers had been decided the moment silver coins changed hands outside her childhood home. She expected nothing beyond witnessing history before quietly disappearing again. Then, almost without warning, she felt something impossible to explain. A gentle warmth spread through the air despite the winter evening. It reminded her of standing beneath the first sunlight after weeks of snowfall. She slowly lifted her eyes. Across the crowded pavilion, the white Alpha King had stopped walking. His advisors continued speaking before gradually realizing he was no longer beside them. The entire procession slowed. The king stood perfectly still, his gaze directed toward the far corner where Evelyn remained beside the wooden pillar. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them stretched across dozens of guests, flickering lanterns, and polished stone, yet Evelyn felt as though every sound around her had quietly disappeared. She quickly looked behind herself, convinced he must be observing someone else. There was no one there. When she turned back, his calm silver eyes still rested upon her with quiet recognition rather than curiosity. He did not seem surprised to find her. It felt as though he had been searching for her all evening. An elderly advisor stepped closer and whispered respectfully, "Your Majesty, the introductions are continuing." The king never looked away from Evelyn. His answer came softly enough that only those nearest could hear, yet every word carried unwavering certainty. "I know." Then, to the astonishment of the royal court, he stepped away from the center aisle entirely and began walking toward the quiet young woman standing alone at the edge of the gathering, while hundreds of silent eyes instinctively turned to follow him. The silence that followed seemed to stretch far beyond the walls of the Grand Moon Pavilion. Every measured step of the white Alpha King echoed across the polished stone floor as though time itself had slowed to witness where he was going. Nobles exchanged bewildered glances. Advisors stood frozen with unfinished notes in their hands. Vanessa Sinclair and the other distinguished Omegas watched in growing disbelief as the king walked past every celebrated family without hesitation. He did not pause before jeweled gowns or famous bloodlines. His attention remained fixed on the quiet young woman standing beside the weathered wooden pillar at the very edge of the gathering. Evelyn instinctively stepped backward, convinced she must somehow be blocking his path. She lowered her head respectfully and moved aside. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "please forgive me." The king stopped only a few feet away. His expression remained calm, yet his silver eyes carried unmistakable warmth. "There is nothing to forgive," he replied. His voice was gentle, deep, and steady enough to quiet even the restless whispers surrounding them. Evelyn slowly looked up, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. For the first time in her life, someone of unquestionable authority was looking directly at her rather than through her. She felt no judgment in his gaze, no curiosity, no pity, only quiet recognition that somehow made her heart beat faster than before. Behind the king, the high priest exchanged a puzzled glance with the royal advisors. One elderly noble cautiously cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," he began, "the formal introductions are still awaiting your attention." Without taking his eyes from Evelyn, the king answered, "I have already found the person I wish to meet." A ripple of astonishment spread across the pavilion. Conversations that had been carefully restrained only moments earlier threatened to break into open murmurs before the royal guard restored silence with respectful gestures. Evelyn could not understand what was happening. She had spent years believing she was invisible. Now hundreds of strangers were watching her stand before the most respected ruler in the Northern Territories. She lowered her eyes once more. "I believe there has been a mistake," she said quietly. "I am not from a noble family." The king's faint smile carried neither amusement nor surprise. "I know. I was not invited as an honored guest. I know." She hesitated before speaking the truth she had hidden from no one. "My own family did not want me." Those words lingered in the cold evening air. Several nearby guests looked away uncomfortably. Others silently waited for the king to step back and return to the ceremony. Instead, he answered with complete certainty. "A family's fear does not determine a person's worth." Evelyn felt something tighten gently inside her chest. No one had ever spoken those words to her before. Not once in 19 years. Before she could respond, a sudden movement near the open entrance caught everyone's attention. The tiny white wolf pup she had rescued beside the frozen creek only 2 days earlier came running through the pavilion, weaving effortlessly between startled guests. Several guards instinctively reached toward the small animal before immediately stopping. The little wolf ignored everyone else. It hurried straight toward Evelyn, happily circling her feet before sitting beside her with its tail gently sweeping across the polished floor. A wave of astonished whispers filled the hall. "That is the royal wolf. How did it find her? It never approaches strangers." Evelyn knelt instinctively, smiling with genuine surprise as she stroked the pup's snowy fur. "You found your way here," she whispered. The little wolf looked up at her with bright silver eyes before affectionately resting its head against her hand. The white Alpha King quietly watched the moment unfold. "His name is Orion," he said. Evelyn looked up in surprise. "He belongs to you." The king nodded once. "He disappeared several days ago during a winter storm." Evelyn's expression softened. "I only helped him because he was frightened." "I know," the king answered. "I watched you." Her eyes widened. Memories of the distant white wolf standing upon the rocky ridge suddenly returned with startling clarity. She looked from Orion back to the king, slowly realizing the impossible truth. He had witnessed everything from the moment she chose kindness without expecting anything in return. Around them, the gathered nobles remained completely silent, sensing that something far greater than ceremony was unfolding beneath the rising winter moon. Even the high priest studied the scene with growing wonder as a faint silver glow began reflecting across the ancient moonstone platform, illuminating the pavilion with a soft light that had not appeared during any previous introduction that evening. The silver light spreading across the ancient moonstone platform grew brighter with every passing heartbeat until the entire Grand Moon Pavilion seemed wrapped in a quiet glow. No one spoke. Even the winter wind that had drifted through the open arches moments before now felt strangely still, as though the night itself had chosen to witness what was about to happen. Orion remained beside Evelyn, gently pressing against her leg while she stood frozen, unable to understand why every eye in the kingdom had suddenly turned toward her. The high priest slowly descended from the platform, his weathered hands resting upon an ancient silver staff carved with the symbols of the moon goddess. His thoughtful eyes moved from the glowing moonstone to the white Alpha King and finally to Evelyn. For several long moments, he simply watched in silence. Then a quiet smile touched his face, one that seemed filled with both surprise and recognition. "It has been many years," he said softly, his voice carrying through the enormous hall with remarkable clarity, "since these sacred stones answered the presence of two souls before a declaration was ever spoken." The astonished whispers that followed quickly faded again as every guest waited for him to continue. The elderly priest turned toward Evelyn with gentle kindness. "Child, would you please step forward?" Evelyn hesitated, looking toward the king as though asking permission without words. He offered only a calm nod that somehow gave her the courage to move. She walked carefully across the polished floor until she stood upon the center of the moonstone platform. The moment both of her feet touched its smooth surface, the silver glow beneath her became brighter, flowing through the carved lines like moonlight traveling across a quiet river. Gasps echoed throughout the pavilion. The high priest closed his eyes briefly before opening an ancient leather-bound book that had rested beside the ceremonial altar throughout the evening. Its pages had yellowed with age, and the silver lettering upon them shimmered beneath the growing light. He slowly read aloud. "When winter grants the kingdom a daughter clothed in white, and compassion walks before pride, the guardian of the northern moon shall recognize her before the world does." The words settled gently over the silent gathering. Several elders exchanged astonished looks. Others quietly searched their memories, realizing they had heard fragments of that forgotten prophecy during childhood, but had long believed it was only legend. The high priest continued reading. "The chosen Luna shall not be measured by lineage, wealth, or appearance, but by the quiet strength that chooses mercy when no reward is promised." His eyes lifted from the ancient page and rested upon Evelyn with unmistakable certainty. Kindness has always been the first sign. Memories suddenly unfolded before the gathering like pieces of a forgotten story. Gideon stepped forward from among the attendants and respectfully bowed. "Your Majesty, I witnessed this young woman free a frightened white wolf pup during our journey north." The elderly woman carrying the basket of roses spoke next. "She helped me when everyone else hurried past." Then the mother of the little girl near the fountain raised her hand. "She rescued my daughter's treasured toy without asking for thanks." Quiet voices began rising from every direction as strangers remembered small acts they had barely noticed only hours earlier. She had smiled at frightened children. She had thanked servants. She had greeted workers with respect. She had never answered humiliation with bitterness. None of those moments had seemed extraordinary alone. Together, they revealed a heart unlike any other. Evelyn listened in stunned silence, her eyes filling with quiet emotion. She had never imagined anyone had been watching. The white Alpha King stepped forward until he stood beside her upon the glowing stone. Looking neither at the nobles nor at the assembled court, he spoke directly to Evelyn. "You believed no one saw your kindness because no one praised it. But true character has never required an audience." He slowly removed the magnificent white cloak fastened across his shoulders, embroidered with silver wolves and moonlit branches, the ceremonial mantle worn only by the ruler of the Northern Territories. Every noble understood the meaning of what he was about to do. With gentle care, he placed the cloak around Evelyn's shoulders, shielding her simple gray dress beneath its warm folds. The rich white fabric settled naturally against her pale hair as though it had always belonged there. A quiet murmur swept across the pavilion, not of disbelief now, but of awe. The king looked into her crystal blue eyes and spoke with calm certainty that carried to every corner of the hall. "From this moment forward, no one here will remember you as the girl who was abandoned. They will remember you as the woman whose heart earned the respect of a kingdom before she ever wore a crown. Tears glistened in Evelyn's eyes, but she did not speak. She simply stood beneath the rising winter moon wrapped in the royal cloak while hundreds of witnesses slowly understood that destiny had chosen someone the world had almost failed to see. The Grand Moon Pavilion remained wrapped in reverent silence long after the white Alpha King's cloak settled across Evelyn's shoulders. No one seemed willing to breathe too loudly, afraid the fragile beauty of the moment might disappear if reality returned too quickly. Snow drifted gently through the open arches, each white flake glowing beneath the moonlight as though the heavens themselves had joined the ceremony. Evelyn carefully touched the edge of the royal cloak, hardly believing it rested upon her own shoulders. The fabric was warm despite the winter air, carrying the faint scent of cedar, mountain snow, and the quiet strength that surrounded the king wherever he walked. She looked toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your Majesty, I do not know how to carry such an honor." His expression softened with quiet understanding. "You already have," he answered. "You carried it every time you chose compassion when the world offered you none." His words settled deeply within her heart. For years she had believed kindness was simply the only way she knew how to survive. She had never imagined those ordinary choices possessed any greater meaning. The high priest slowly closed the ancient book and addressed the assembled kingdom once more. Many have misunderstood the oldest prophecies because they searched for greatness where greatness rarely begins. They searched among crowns, fortunes, and celebrated names. Yet the moon goddess has always favored humble hearts. He lifted the weathered volume high enough for those nearest to see the faded silver lettering upon its cover. This prophecy has remained unread for generations because no living witness had ever fulfilled its first sign. Tonight, that has changed. Murmurs spread through the gathered nobles, but they no longer carried ridicule. Instead, they carried reflection. Many quietly remembered the moments they had overlooked throughout the evening. They remembered the young woman who had gathered scattered roses without seeking recognition. They remembered the frightened child she had comforted beside the fountain. They remembered the respectful smile she had offered servants who were often ignored by those of higher rank. One by one, those small memories became impossible to dismiss. Across the pavilion, Vanessa Sinclair slowly lowered her eyes. The confidence she had worn so proudly earlier that evening had given way to quiet humility. She stepped forward until she stood several feet from Evelyn. "I judged you before I knew you," she admitted sincerely. "I believed appearance revealed a person's value. I was mistaken." Evelyn looked at her with the same gentle expression she had offered everyone else throughout the festival. "We all learn at different moments," she replied softly. "What matters is choosing kindness after we understand." Vanessa smiled with grateful relief, and the quiet tension between them disappeared like mist beneath morning sunlight. Nearby, Gideon watched with peaceful satisfaction. He had wondered since the journey began whether the frightened young woman sitting silently inside his wagon might one day discover the worth she had never been allowed to see in herself. Now he realized the journey had never truly been about bringing Evelyn to the festival. It had been about bringing the festival to the truth it had forgotten. The White Alpha King turned toward the assembled court. "For too many years," he said, "our kingdom has mistaken difference for weakness and appearances for destiny. Tonight we remember that the measure of a person has never rested upon the color of their hair, the shade of their eyes, or the opinions of those who failed to understand them." His calm voice carried across every corner of the pavilion. Character is revealed by the choices no one expects us to make. Heads slowly bowed throughout the gathering, not from command, but from genuine respect. Evelyn felt tears warming her eyes once again, yet this time they carried no loneliness. For the first time in her life, she stood among people who were no longer looking at what made her different. They were looking at who she truly was. Above them, the full moon emerged completely from behind the passing clouds, bathing the valley in radiant silver light. Orion lifted his head and released a soft, joyful howl that echoed across the mountains. Moments later, wolves throughout the distant forests answered one after another, their voices weaving together into a peaceful chorus that rolled across the snow-covered land. The high priest smiled toward the glowing sky. The old songs say the forests themselves rejoice whenever truth is finally recognized. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment, listening to the chorus carried upon the winter wind. She realized that for the first time since childhood, she no longer felt like someone searching for a place to belong. Without speaking another word, she simply stood beside the white Alpha King beneath the moonlit heavens, and the silence around them felt more like home than anything she had ever known. Morning arrived beneath a sky as clear as polished crystal, and the first light of dawn painted the snow-covered mountains in soft shades of gold. The Grand Moon Pavilion had been transformed overnight for the final ceremony. Fresh white roses lined the central pathway, silver banners danced gently in the winter breeze, and hundreds of guests gathered once again, not out of curiosity this time, but out of genuine anticipation. The whispers that had once followed Evelyn wherever she walked had disappeared completely. In their place came warm smiles, respectful bows, and quiet greetings from people who had finally learned to see beyond appearances. Evelyn stood inside a small chamber overlooking the valley, wearing a graceful white gown embroidered with delicate silver threads that reflected the morning light like frost upon fresh snow. Her pale hair flowed freely across her shoulders beneath the royal cloak the white Alpha King had placed around her the night before. She looked at her reflection for a long moment, hardly recognizing the young woman staring back. Not because the clothing had changed her, but because for the first time she no longer saw herself through the fear and shame that others had spent years placing upon her. A gentle knock sounded at the wooden door. Gideon stepped inside carrying a small wooden box. He smiled warmly before opening it to reveal a simple silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. "This belonged to my late wife," he said quietly. "She always believed that true beauty could never be hidden forever. I think she would have wanted you to wear it today." Evelyn's eyes shimmered with gratitude as she accepted the gift with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will treasure it always." Outside, the royal trumpets announced the beginning of the ceremony. The great doors opened, and sunlight poured into the hall as Evelyn stepped forward. Every guest rose together. The musicians began a quiet melody that echoed gently across the valley while Orion trotted proudly beside her, his snowy coat glowing beneath the morning sky. At the center of the moonstone platform, the white Alpha King waited with the same calm expression she had first noticed when he entered the festival. Yet today there was something new in his eyes. Not only certainty, but unmistakable joy. As Evelyn approached, he extended his hand without speaking. She placed her hand gently into his, and together they turned toward the assembled kingdom. The high priest lifted the ancient ceremonial crown, crafted from polished silver branches woven together with tiny white gemstones that caught the morning light. "Let all gathered here bear witness," he declared. "A kingdom is strongest when its leaders reflect the virtues they hope to inspire. Compassion before pride, mercy before judgment, truth before appearances." He carefully placed the crown upon Evelyn's head. It settled perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her all along. The valley erupted into warm applause that echoed across the mountains. Families who had traveled for days smiled openly. Children waved small white banners. Even the proudest nobles bowed with sincere respect. The white Alpha King looked toward Evelyn and spoke clearly enough for every person to hear. "Today I do not honor you because destiny chose you. I honor you because long before destiny revealed itself, you chose kindness when no one was watching. That is the heart our kingdom deserves beside its throne." Evelyn felt tears gather once again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. She turned toward the crowd, taking a slow breath before speaking for the first time before the entire kingdom. "For many years I believed being different meant I would always walk alone. I know there are others who still feel unseen, unwanted, or misunderstood. If my story means anything, I hope it reminds them that another person's fear can never define their worth. The greatest gift we can offer one another is the choice to see with compassion before we judge with our eyes." Her quiet words settled over the valley more powerfully than any celebration could have. Many parents instinctively reached for their children's hands. Friends embraced. Strangers smiled at one another. In that moment, something greater than a royal ceremony had taken place. Hearts had changed. As the celebration continued beneath the bright winter sky, the white Alpha King and Evelyn walked together through the gathered crowd, stopping often to greet servants, craftsmen, travelers, and children with the same warmth they offered every noble guest. No one stood too low to deserve their attention. No one was too ordinary to receive a smile. High above the valley, a flock of white birds soared gracefully across the endless blue sky, while Orion raced happily through the fresh snow below, his joyful spirit reminding everyone of the frightened little wolf who had once been rescued by a quiet young woman expecting nothing in return. Years later, people would tell many stories about that unforgettable winter festival. Some would remember the royal ceremony. Others would remember the ancient prophecy. But the story repeated most often from one generation to the next was much simpler. They would say that the greatest queen the Northern Territories had ever known first earned her crown not through power, wealth, or perfect appearance, but through a heart that never stopped choosing kindness, even when the world forgot to choose it for her.